Hello and welcome everybody to episode 13 of the TreeLines Podcast, ArborGen TreeLines Podcast. Lucky number 13, Jason. We have come a long way from number one, and we've gotten to number 13, and you're our guest today for this great episode. But today we're going to be talking about planting fewer trees and to grow more value. Less can be more. We came out with a webinar a while back that was titled Less Can Be More. But, you know, we're going to talk about why MCP is changing the Sawtimber strategy today. And not to jump into it too quick, but not to drag around either. I want to get into this because it's a very great topic. But to introduce my guest today, my fearless colleague, and one of my closest friends, Jason Watson, and classmate at Mississippi State University, College of Forest Resources. So today is an all MSU episode. But today we're going to be speaking with you, Jason, about something that it's a very hot topic in forestry right now, because I know when I give presentations and I do public speaking events, like I did two last week. You know, this topic always comes up. What keyed this, or what started this whole discussion, or the reason why you were on this episode today talking about this, was you wrote an article, a post on Facebook, and you've wrote an article for TreeLines about it, and we had a post on Facebook that generated a lot of discussion. And that's what we strive for, is for people to have discussion about it. But again, Jason Watson, I'd like to, get your input on this today. But beginning to start off, maybe if you want to do a little introduction. I think you're a seasoned veteran right now, but for somebody who has not listened to episodes 1 through 12, I encourage them to go back and listen to those episodes, but they would have seen you on some of those. You want to give us a little background, and then we can jump into this hot topic.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me again, Paul. I guess I feel honored to have gotten another invitation to come back and join you. And, I guess that says something, counts for something. But no, seriously, it's really great to be back. And yeah, so I do think I hold the distinction, yes, of being on the first podcast with you, where we kind of the inaugural, I guess you could say, sort of issue or episode. So yeah, I'm originally from Meridian, Mississippi. I attended Mississippi State University, where I got my Bachelor of Science in Forestry, 1996. Later, worked for a while in the industry, had the bright idea, and it really was a good decision, but I don't know if I'd recommend it to anybody in their 40s, but went back to graduate school to dear old state again, and did a Master of Science degree with an emphasis in genetics and silviculture. And I've been with ArborGen actually since 2012, and now serve as the U.S. sales director. Live in South Carolina, where our headquarters are. I always tell people it's kind of like a new adventure every day. With we're certainly a big part too of the dynamic timber market, so we play a piece in that. And it's been a very fun industry to be a part of, and it gets more interesting, I think, every day. And just glad to be here again. Thanks, Paul. Look forward to this conversation.
Well, thank you for coming on again today. You said you'd been with ArborGen for how many years now?
Let's see. This year will make 14 years that I've been at ArborGen.
So you were
half my career.
Yeah, you will always be older than I am, Jason. So you graduated from state in 96. I graduated in 98. And you've been with the company for 14 years, going on 14. I'm going on 12. So, it's kind of like you're paving the way, and I'm just following along behind. But I think you and I both, listening to both of us talk, when we get into talking about forest genetics, and we get into talking about reforestation and the environment in general, one thing I think that I've had people tell me that have listened to you is that Jason Watson is very passionate about seedlings genetics, and he's very passionate about forestry. And I think that is something that you and I both share is, we both grew up. I grew up, in Detroit, Alabama on family farm. You grew up in Collins, Meridian, Mississippi area, their family farm. We both grew up with that same background of we're just passionate about it. And that is what I enjoy about my job so much. And I can tell you enjoy your job as well. But, I'd like to say that you enjoy your job so much because you get to work with me every day and vice versa. But, we do have a passion about what we do. So today, I just want to, we want to discuss how shifting timber markets and lower planting densities are changing reforestation strategies, and and why the higher genetics like MCP are becoming more important than ever if this is the technique or the tactic that you are going to use. It is incredibly important if you're going to use this, if this is going to be your management strategy and this is the way you're going to go forward. And let's face it, look, in forestry for private landowners, you need a plan. You need a management plan and that's your roadmap. You and I first learned in forestry school that you need a management plan. We had to both write one to get out, and that is your roadmap. Well, if this is going to be your plan and this is the road that you're going to take, you got to change. You got to change some things. And, your article kind of sparked some discussion. So, let's first start off by talking about the history. Let's
Yeah.
talk about the history of planting density. What do you remember, or what was the history that you learned when we were in school?
Well, yeah, we're always, I guess, what is the old saying that the only constant is change, and so we are constantly changing. And I know
Yes.
certainly, I still remember actually the first I was with. So to give you just a little bit of a background of that to kind of inform where this will go, I actually worked first of all with a company, a hardwood sawmill, Anderson Tully Company, and I was in the upland hardwood division. Block 4 was the name of it, and I worked for Glenn Brown out of Vicksburg. And so mostly there was some, we were planting some hardwood seedlings, but a lot of that was natural regen just because the soils are just so adept at growing hardwoods over in that area, Vicksburg, and then of course the Mississippi Delta. But we also managed about 10,000 acres of pine. And I was, for whatever reason, I was kind of put in quote unquote charge of regenerating some of the stands. And I'll never forget, I think one of our first stands was at the old 6x10 trees per acre, all which 726 trees per acre. And that was kind of a standard. I even remember in Sam Land's Principles of Silviculture class and John Hodges's Practices of Silviculture class talking about 726 trees per acre was a fairly standard recommendation back in those days for a number of reasons. By then we were doing much better in terms of like seedling quality, but this will be kind of interesting to see where this goes. But another reason why I'll never forget, just kind of an aside here, but these kind of stories or these anecdotes are sometimes kind of useful to harken back to. But when I was when I was actually in college doing my undergraduate work at Mississippi State, I was really fortunate enough to work for forest technicians, Craig Hitt. He's in Collinsville, Mississippi still, Scotty Mayat. And of course, my cohort was Shane Mayat. Those guys are all still in the business. I hope at some point they would listen to this and kind of get a kick out of these old stories. But one of the things they would let Shane and I do, we weren't cruising the big valuable timber sales. They let us go out and do the pre-merch cruises, which built a lot of character from Greenbrier scratches on your arms and, giving blood out on some of these sites that were only, 7 to 10 years old.
Right.
One of the things I remember is we were doing those pre-merge cruises, those inventories on, in kind of east central Mississippi on Weyerhaeuser and also international paper land at the time. And those were all established, from 600 and maybe 80 trees per acre to 726 trees per acre. And it was just common, you had to enter the stocking rate into the tally sheets or the little handheld computer. Believe it or not, we even had those back then. But those stocking rates were just ubiquitous. I mean, those were the common stocking rates that were used, Paul.
Yeah. And there was multiple reasons that we can visit today about why those stocking rates were so high. Talking about historical numbers, I
Hmm.
have even heard of planting densities being more than 726. Days of old, they would be 800, 900 plus trees per
Yeah.
acre that were planted back then, and we can and I want to visit this. We can talk about why they were so high and why
Hmm.
there were multiple reasons. So,
Right.
getting into reason number one, and it's even discussed in Philip C. Wakely's 1954 publication, Planting the Southern Pines, the old
Mhm.
textbook that we still use and everything. It's mentioned in there. Planting densities back then, because seedling quality was not what it is today, and because we do
Mhm.
not have the knowledge back then. Planting
Right.
densities sometimes was used as an insurance for survival.
Certainly. Yeah. Yeah, that's
Uh,
right, Paul. I mean, you think about it, the Southern Forest Nursery Cooperative at Auburn University was formed 1970, but there was still a lot to learn about seedling quality. And I mean, before that, you talk about Wakely's. Wakely's work was just an incredible, I used to laugh. I say this in presentations sometimes. Ironically, gave a presentation at Auburn not too long ago where I talked about, I don't think Philip Wakely ever slept to
yeah,
put that book together. But that is one of the things they talk about. You're exactly right. And going back to the 1950s and the 60s, another guy, Victor Byland out in East Texas, was talking about the chronic, the really just ongoing problems of seedling survival. There were a lot of papers, peer reviewed papers that were authored talking about seedling quality being an issue. And you just hit the nail on the head. It was an insurance policy. So between really like seedling quality and even going back to, the Soil Conservation Service being formed, there's old pictures from kind of like where you're from, Paul, up in kind of northern Alabama, northern Mississippi, where people were doing a lot of excess farming and the topsoil was gone. There were just gullies everywhere.
yeah.
Pretty amazing. So it wasn't really a bad idea at the time to go in and plant those high stocking rates and um, you know, try to repair a lot of those the soil problems. It was almost could have become the Dust Bowl, but over in Mississippi and
Well,
Alabama.
yeah, I mean, and look, Jason, let's face it, that was why the cost share program CRP
Hmm.
and I don't want to chase a side street here, but those soil and erosion problems was why the CRP program was first developed. Was to help with that. But
True. Yeah.
getting back to the topic at hand, you know, it's not uncommon now, and I don't want to chase this side street, but it's not uncommon now for to hear of, well, survival issues. Has there been a survival issue this year? Everything impacts seedling survival. And we're not going to chase this rabbit, but I just want to say that, I get comments all the time from landowners, foresters, tree planters, people in the industry that, we used to not have
Mhm.
problems with seedling survival. No, yeah, you did. You had problems. There's always been problems with seedling
Yeah.
survival. The thing was, though, back in the day, you had 7 to 8 to 900 trees per acre that you didn't see, but there were reasons for that, and there's reasons why we're gonna get on right now into why we don't do that anymore, or you're seeing a trend to go backwards, and that's
Hmm.
genetic variability. Let's
Hmm.
face it, back in those days when Wakely and those pioneers, legends in our industry, were doing their work,
Hmm.
Bruce Zobel, Dr. Zobel, father of
Yeah.
tree improvement, when they were doing their work, when they started in the 1950s, Jason, was there any genetic improvement at that time?
No, I mean, that's when it was, and, Zobel, Bruce Zobel had a hard enough time convincing the industry the value that could be unlocked from the power of genetics. But no, there wasn't. There certainly was not. So that was another big factor in having to plant. And I think, and I know this is where we're going to go with a lot of this too, Paul, today on the podcast is, there was the survival issue. There was one big, thing that was why you planted a lot more seedlings per acre. But the other big issue was tree quality, genetics, or, we were just having a discussion about this yesterday within family variation. That's the way the geneticists refer to it. And I can, not to get ahead of ourselves here, but going back to, me getting a start in those summers of 1994, when I was tallying those 726 trees per acre in the pre-merchantable loblolly pine stands for International Paper and Weyerhaeuser, and that doesn't matter who it would have been, by the way. It could have been Georgia Pacific. It could have been Union Camp.
Right.
I'm not picking on Weyerhaeuser or International Paper whatsoever. It was every third or fourth tree, and then maybe 3 trees in a row, I was tallying Crenartium or Freesiform rust or a low fork in the first 16 feet, which is automatically going to qualify that tree, or excessive stem sweep is going to keep it in pulpwood for a long time. So people were also planting a lot of those trees because you had to count on having at least approximately 50 to 55% of the stand that was going to be pulpwood. So you needed a lot of trees per acre to ensure you had enough logs, even somewhat evenly distributed, for the final harvest. And that's
Right.
another really big, that was just as big as an issue as survival, quite frankly.
Right. Right. And you mentioned a term there that is going to lead us segue us into the next talk about is the pulp and the pulp industry and how that was a major player back in those times and how that
Yep.
is going today. Today we see the markets changing, we see the industry changing, we see things, uses of products changing. But back in those days, when they were planting that many trees per acre, they were going to be able to get rid of that pulpwood. They were going to be able to move that.
Hmm.
I've talked about it many times. I've talked about it probably on this podcast before. I've talked about it in multiple meetings, but up here where I am, we had a pulp mill that was very close by. I remember my grandparents on my family property
Yeah.
growing trees to feed that pulp mill, and in one night that pulp mill was gone. And it has completely changed it's completely changed my personal and my family's views on how we're going to
Hmm.
manage our timber going forward. But what were the markets like when this strategy worked? When the strategy of 800 to 900 trees per acre worked, what were those markets like? We had a pulp mill on
Yeah.
every corner.
We sure did. I mean, it was a very vibrant business, the pulp and paper industry. I can think about one of the first connections I made. Because, when you're just kind of getting interested in a discipline like forestry for me, I remember, I think there may still be a wood yard in this particular place, but if you're on Interstate 20, just before, if you're headed in Meridian, Mississippi, of course, where I said where I'm from, and you're going down Interstate 20 and you're traveling toward Jackson, so you're going west. There was always a big wood yard there. It might
Yep,
still be there in some shape or form today. I think it might still be
it
there,
is.
but
It is.
it was probably even bigger back when, the company James River, and then I think it maybe became Fort James, was really running strong. And it was very, very big. I mean, the whole property was filled up with small diameter wood. But
Mhm.
that was just kind of a microcosm of, you had this healthy industry where, landowners are making decisions and they could feel really good about making decisions. And virtually from East Texas back to Virginia, there was that stratified market of you set up your regime as a private landowner or forest industry to know that you had a home for those small diameter trees. And most people were thinning. Look, I mean, we talked today about like one thin regimes, but people it was always at least two thinnings, and sometimes 3 thinnings, maybe even 4. I don't know. Some
Yeah,
people wanted to carry them forever, and some people I think can still do that because they have very niche markets they sell to, but it's few and far between now. But you're exactly right. There was a very your North Alabama example is perfect because it was a healthy market for all those small diameter trees all over the place in the southern United States.
Yeah. I mean, it was, a lot of towns, a lot of people thrived or
Yep.
lived off of that pulpwood market.
Yep.
Even more than just selling wood, but the other businesses that sprung up around those mills, the other businesses that depended on those, the communities that depended on that as
Mhm.
their, income, and then the districts. I'll never forget. Again, not trying to chase a rabbit, but the them after that mill closed, the school district around that area had to
Mhm.
completely change their way they were budgeting for products, because that mill provided the school districts around the area with the paper for, and then in one night, all of that's gone,
That's right.
so,
Yeah. Not
but
to mention the tax base for all of the
exactly.
schools. I mean, that and all the ancillary businesses like auto parts and supply parts for all the yeah, it definitely has a ripple effect. I mean, for certain. And then of course ultimately, like we're talking about today, the impact on the timber management.
Right, right. But we're seeing a change in products that, people back in those times, everybody got a newspaper on at least once a week delivered on the doorstep. Some
Yeah.
got one every day. And then you just, with the onset of the digital age and everything, you're just not seeing that anymore.
Yeah.
But,
That's right.
it is that the pulp market has changed so much over the last decade. And anytime you're going to have changes in markets, you're going to have changes in the way you're producing the products to feed those markets. Overnight, there was a complete change in the need for those small diameter trees that could go into those mills, that it didn't matter if they were forked. It didn't matter if they had a fusiform rust gall on them. Did not
Mhm.
matter if they had a crooked stem. Those trees were never going to be a saw log or a pole, and they were never going to go into a sawmill or a pole mill. I've always made
Right.
the statement that you can put a saw log in a pulp mill, but you can't put a pulp log in a sawmill. But
Yep.
you can't go backwards with that. So, but we have seen pulp and paper mill closures now. I think the one that I was talking about in North Alabama was one of the first that we saw. But now it has just kind of like the dam has broken loose on
Yeah, and Paul, we had a fascinating discussion recently. You and I did with Amanda Lang on a previous episode.
episode 12.
Yeah, and so of course, Florisk, and certainly others have documented this extensively. It's interesting the catalyst really for everything we have today, like the genetics research, silviculture research. I mean, you name it, fertilization. I mean, everything we have was really, I mean, the beginning, the genesis of all that was the pulp and paper industry. And then, of course, after World War II, the lumber, of course, everything was booming and the lumber industry really took off then. But, we've rocked along for all these 60 to 70 years. And the aging infrastructure, as they talk about some of this infrastructure at the mills is 70, 80 years old. I mean,
Hmm.
and so some of the companies unfortunately have chosen not to reinvest in some of these mills. And I mean, I think I think a number, and I'm going to approximate it here, but maybe in the last 4 to 5 years we've lost like 35 million tons in the United States of capacity. Maybe in the Southern US alone, it's like 23 to 25 million,
Right.
roughly. I mean, when you were talking about North Alabama, I was thinking about places like Perry, Florida, and Georgetown, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia. Savannah, Georgia, the behemoth international paper facilities that people thought would be there forever. And
Right.
all of a sudden, we find ourselves in a place where um, they're not reinvesting in those mills. They decide to shut them down. I think, one saving grace is, and we'll talk about this too. We'll kind of give a little disclaimer. There are some places where thankfully, companies like Georgia Pacific um, and International Paper, Paul, your home state brethren in Southern Alabama have had a little bit of an injection of new capital, big time going into Southern Alabama. So, everything we're going to talk about today too, and some of these decisions are micro, they're micro market decisions because it's
Right.
all based on where you are geographically, certainly. But we have had a big change, no doubt about
Yes, and I can hear the comments now. Well,
it.
my pulp industry is still going strong, or my
Yep,
pulp mill is still here today. And are you saying that I still need to lower my planting density, even though my pulp mill still running strong? I can hear the
yep.
comments from the listeners now, and are the landowners feeling this shift yet? And I would have to say that not in every area. Like you said, we've got those micro markets there to where landowners are still. I'm envious. I'm not shy to say it. I'm envious of some people, of the people
For
in some
sure.
areas,
Yeah.
as anybody would be. I mean, I still hear, I don't want to discuss prices or anything, but there are still people out there that are getting good stumpage prices to the landowner but are landowners feeling this shift yet in the changes in the markets? And I would have to say yes, they definitely are across the majority of the region.
Yeah, for
You
sure.
know, and that leads us into the questions that I continue to get is, what does that mean for someone who is planting stands, timbered trees today, seedlings today, that are going to be harvested 15 to 20 years, 25 years from now? And
Yeah.
I can tell you what it means to me. I think I know what it means to you, but what have you seen across the market?
Well, how long do we have? No, I'm kidding.
Exactly. May need to do that multiple episodes.
Yeah, yeah. Well, gosh, but there are so many factors. And, if you step back for just a minute, we're I think we do say that, gosh, the market is more dynamic than it's ever been. And we're probably going to say that again 5 years from now, because guess what? We're in a global market, and we
Mhm.
have been for some time, but we're certainly in global forest products markets. And I think that, you almost kind of have to, even though you live in a micro market, you need to be kind of thinking big picture at the same time. And I think that, and before I kind of put the cart before the horse, I want to mention something too that kind of informs decisions that we have the ability to make, and I'll kind of clarify why I'm saying the ability to make and how fortunate we are. You mentioned earlier, Paul, because you were talking about Wakely and Bruce Sobel and all the giants that have come before us that have done such foundational work, and we should reference that. That's something we should look back on. And I know that not long after I started working for John Pate at Cell4 and then followed him to Arborgen, he was the first one that exposed me to some of the really good work by University of Georgia's Plantation Management Research Cooperative. And this is a really important point I want to mention. Our good friend, my good friend, Barry Shiver, Dr. Barry Shiver, when he was still on faculty and director of the PMRC over in Athens, and alongside working with guys like Leon Pinar and Mike Harrison, they did a really wonderful, a really forward-thinking study. It was a spacing study, a culture density spacing study, like a region-wide. I don't even remember how many plots they installed, so I'm not going to take a guess and get it wrong. But a very good replicated study. And this is back in when these were
Mhm.
being installed in the 1990s, when they were analyzing some of the results through mid-rotation age. But there was absolutely zero difference in the volume, tunable volume, uh, through age 14, I believe I'm correct, between 400 trees per acre and 800 trees per acre. And those were foundational results to get, because it told us that, if we're still on, and it still informs what we do today. If we want to plant 726 per acre, we know we're going to have a pulp mill in our backyard for the next, 15 to 20 years. We've got the flexibility to do that. But it also may tell us something more important. And that is, we could drop our trees per acre all the way down to, say, 500 to 450, and still know that we're growing the same volume if we're planting 726 trees per acre, that some people that have been around for a long time are still comfortable with. But what it tells you is that you've got a much more marketable tree for a lot of different markets
Right.
if you plant it at 450 to 500 to 550 trees per acre, because it can grow into a chip and saw tree much faster than one planted at a higher density. And so it just gives you options. And you layer that on with the genetic improvement, and the better seedling quality, landowners can be a lot more confident that where it used to be, if Paul Jeffries goes out and he plants in Detroit, Alabama, and he plants 600 trees, 650 trees per acre, uh, instead of having to do that, he can go in and plant 450 to 500 trees per acre. 70% of those trees, 70 to 80%, are going to be of sawtimber potential before he ever thins it. Whereas his neighbor down the road may be planting over 600 trees per acre um, of a lower genotype, and he's still stuck with 50% of that being pulpwood. Well, where's he going to sell it potentially?
Right. Right. And to go back to your point there, discussing Dr. Schaper's article there about planting density, I mean, planting density research has been going on since the beginning
Long time.
of
Yeah,
forestry.
very
But
long
what
time.
they did find in that study was that the stands that were planted, even though they said the same merchantable volume from 400 up to above 800 trees per acre, the stands that were planted 800 and above, they had 0% saw timber
Yeah,
in
they were
those
too small, even at
they
age
were
14.
they had no room to grow. They had
Yeah,
no room to grow. They had hit their carrying capacity. They had no room to grow and to get any bigger. However, in contrast to that, the stands that had 400 trees per acre had more saw timber than any of the other stands because
right.
those trees were given room to grow. They were not constrained by nutrients and water availability. They had not exceeded their carrying capacity and everything. And that's
Exactly.
that's a whole different talking point there. But again, 450 trees per acre, depending on your site,
Right.
500. I get the question a lot now, what is the average planting density across the Southeast and what are people going to? And it's like the age old answer to every forestry question from a forester. Well, it depends.
10
And
foresters will give you 10 different answers.
yes, yes, yes. But I can say with assurance that most people that I'm working with, they are in that 545 to 454 trees per acre range. And that is becoming very common. There's a lot of different benefits to going to that, but and
Right.
and and we'll get into this a little bit later on, but do not think that you can go to those planting densities and keep doing the same thing you've been doing year after year and planting the same thing that you can plant.
Yeah.
But some of the benefits, let's talk about benefits now to the private landowner. The benefits for going to those planting densities, number one, is lowering your establishment cost.
Mhm. Yeah.
Obviously, when you're dealing with producing a commodity that's going to be sold, you've got to take into consideration the cost of the production of that commodity. How much is it going to
Mhm.
cost me to produce this, and how much am I going to be able to sell it for? Well, everybody wants to, they want to increase that selling price and lower that production price. I mean, that's just
Mhm.
simple economics, but you've got a lower establishment cost there that, you're not having to plant or purchase as many trees to plant per acre, but you need to go up in the genetic that you are planting. So obviously you have enough available or more money to spend per seedling
Yeah.
because you are wanting to plant something better. The other benefit, you're giving each individual tree, and let's look at it this way. You're giving each
Right.
individual organism, seedling, tree, you're giving it more room to grow. You're giving it more nutrients that it's going to have to uptake, and you're giving it more water, and you're just giving it an overall better situation to grow, to perform to its highest capability. It's like an athlete. You want to give it the most that you can, that it can to perform.
The best nutrition, the best access to proliferate.
Exactly, exactly. And there's a term, and I learned it at state in my wildlife management courses, but it's also applicable to forestry and agricultural in general. And there's a term called carrying capacity. And when you exceed carrying capacity is the ability of an area to carry an organism, and how many it can carry. And you can it it's been discussed to death, but when you exceed carrying capacity, the organisms that are depending on that um, acreage, that land, that soil, that environment, when
Hmm.
you exceed carrying capacity, they start declining in health. And the
Yeah.
same holds true for timber and forestry. So if you go out there and you put 800 trees per acre, and at about, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, they're going to close canopy. They're going to hit that carrying capacity a lot earlier. Each individual stem is going to have to start depending on less nutrients and less water, available water to survive.
Yeah.
The health of each individual stem is going to start to decline. This growth is going to slow down. And there's a beautiful little critter that loves these stands when they get stressed that come in and they move in, and they just have a bad reputation for thinning timber
Well
stands, but
deserved.
not evenly. And we're talking about the southern pine beetle. And we're not going to chase that. But again, they are attracted to stressed trees. And one is stressed stands of pine trees. And one way to stress a pine is to put its neighbor too close to it and to cause it to struggle to get nutrients and water.
Well
And
said.
then we can go into the wildlife aspects, and the benefits of planting and having more understory browse for wildlife on your stands that have fewer stems per acre. And then you can go into, we can sit here and we
Yep.
could discuss that. But the point I want to get to is the lower density equals a less tolerance for poor genetics.
Yes. You've got to be more intentional.
Exactly. I mean, again, going back to the original purpose of planting so many trees per acre was so that you would have stems out there that would be inevitably quality enough to make it to a mill. And the ones that were not, they were going to the pulp mill that were down the road. So,
Hmm.
we have the two types of seedlings. We have open pollinated and mass control pollinated. That leads us to leaning towards more usage of mass control pollinated seedlings than open pollinated seedlings. Would you agree?
Yes, very much so.
So with open pollinated seedlings, you're looking at 50 to 60% pulpwood trees. You're looking at more variability between your stems because we only know the mother. We don't know the father, and you're looking at a possibility of having more stems out there with poor form.
Yeah, I think that, the if everybody that listens to this podcast could remember one part of the conversation that we talk about here is, dropping your trees per acre comes with a really big caveat of all of a sudden your decision basis becomes much, much more, like I said that word a minute ago, intentional or deliberate about genetics. You've got to be thinking about, because on one hand, it's giving us the options. All of a sudden, we talked about it just a minute ago, dropping those trees per acre down to 450 to maybe 550 seedlings or less. So maybe 550 down to 450 is certainly going to give the landowner a lot more options to grow chip and saw, and Sawtimber. That's where you want to be in where we, in many of the markets we operate in now. But that is, like I said, the caveat is you've got to be really thinking about what are my markets, and talk to your local forestry commission people. Certainly call us, our reforestation advisor team, and you can get that from arborgen.com and find your local. There's a shout out for the website and finding your local reforestation advisor, or talk to your extension forester, but be informed. Know what
Uh-huh.
your markets are. You're going to drop those trees per acre. You want to go into it with the deliberate nature of higher percentage of those trees qualifying for solid wood products. Chip and saw
Right.
and Sawtimber are going to make a 2x4. So you want to de-risk the production of pulpwood, a lot of times, unless you're in one of those really fortunate micro markets. The funny thing is, it still doesn't hurt to drop to those densities if you're sitting right next door to a pulp mill, because you're still going to grow more tons per acre. And instead of 6.5 tons, 7 tons per acre, you may be growing 9 or 10 tons per acre with like an MCP. So, but at least if you're in a place where there's not a pulp mill close by and the markets are not doing well, you've presented yourself a lot more options. It's just got to be with a better genotype. In this case, control pollinated. controlled pollinated genotype.
Right. And just elaborate a little bit on, we're running up on time here, but just elaborate a little bit on how we select and validate our MCP genetics, or mass control pollinated genetics.
Yeah, so controlled, um, my wrist slapped here by Dr. Patrick Cumby, our VP of product development. But I like to say I'm not a geneticist. I have coffee with those guys, but I've been around them long enough that I think I'm somewhat qualified. But yeah, so controlled pollination is really just a breeding technique. So if you see like, hey, these controlled pollinated seedlings are for sale, the number one thing a consumer should ask is, are they tested? And it takes a long time. This is not something that happens in 3 to 5 years. And so it takes a while to breed these, test them in a wide geographical footprint to know that when they go out into the marketplace, they've been verified to know that the performance is going to be what it says in the
And
market.
what traits are they looking at when what traits
Well,
are
they're
they
looking
looking
for
at?
stack traits. That's the power of controlling the mother and the father, is the volume, not only the volume gain, but the straightness of the stem, the reduction in disease, which in a lot of cases in the eastern United States is fusiform rust. Certainly, working reduction is another crucial heritable trait. And we're even looking at new things in forest health now, like brown spot needle blight resistance. We've got some early testing, more to come on that, but there's a huge screening process that goes into place to make sure we're stacking those traits to
Mhm.
create less variability or more uniformity, if you want to say it that way, in a stand for more.
Right. And what does a stand look like when you see this? If you're driving down the country road and you see a stand of trees, you and I think have our
Yeah.
eyes trained to where we can spot these.
Yeah.
Maybe explain it to our listeners what you can see when you see a controlled pollinated tree.
Well, I think you see that stand uniformity. If I know when I'm riding down the road with my family, I'm constantly looking out going, gosh, look at all that fusiform rust. Oh my
Mhm.
gosh. And they're like, gosh, first of all, please watch the road. And second
Yeah.
of all, why do you care? And I care because, I do this every day. And I can also tell, and some of this I'm cheating a little bit because I use Land Glide to know who the landowners are. But I see some of our partners that have been planting control pollinated, MCP seedlings for the last 10 to 15 years. And I see several trees in a row, even before the stand is thinned, that qualify for chip and saw already,
Mhm.
or, if the mill will take them. But they certainly, from a tree quality standpoint, they qualify. They're over 9 inches and they're of chip and saw quality, defect free. That's when I go, gosh, that landowner's got so much optionality. If the pulp prices get good, sell it as pulpwood. But it's just like the idiom you used earlier, the example. You can sell those trees in a pulp mill. Who cares if they pay you $15 to $20 a ton for pulpwood? Send it to the pulp mill.
Right.
That's fine.
Right. I mean,
But
it's yeah.
certainly, if that's a stand that Paul Jeffries owns, he can sell that tree to multiple markets.
Mhm.
He's prepared for a lot of different markets with
Hey,
those stack
you
traits.
have a consistency. You have a consistency across the stand of
That's
quality
right.
trees. You
Yeah.
have fewer defects. You have better form. You've got just got that consistency across that stand, and you've got a greater sawtimber yield. But look, let's go back to the original. What we were talking about matters, and you've got higher value per acre on your your stand for your timber. Face it, and that's what the bottom line is. You're flexible across those markets, like you said. So, in before we wrap up today, if a landowner is planning on planting this coming year, what should they be thinking about?
I know this is your mantra every day. It really still, in all the things we've talked about here, don't forget that, and they taught us this as forestry students, it's all about the landowner's objectives, first and
Mhm.
foremost. Just because we're providing this kind of advice doesn't mean that, look, we still have people that say, I still want to plant, I hear you loud and clear, but I want to plant my MCP at a higher stocking rate.
Yep,
And that's their
605.
decision. The one thing I would say is ask questions. Ask so many questions. Ask questions till you're blue in the face and make sure you're fully informed. But coming back to your question, in the interest of time, the way that they should be thinking, first and foremost, the best advice I could give somebody is be informed. Like we said, the South is not a timber market. The South is hundreds of micro markets. Be
Right.
informed. Be an informed consumer of what the timber market is in your area. Have a long discussion with one of our reforestation advisors, or even just a colleague, or if you're a landowner, you're consulting a professional forester. Be informed, and then take it from there first about the market you're operating in. And then if you're going to be thinking about dropping those trees per acre, be really focused on conducting good site preparation that your tract needs from an individual tract standpoint, not a blanket prescription. If you're dropping those trees per acre, say it over and over again, be genetics focused. Think about there's different options for MCP that could maybe be more of a fit for your scenario, but think about the importance of optimization, creating trees that can be sold as more of one than one product.
Right.
Is I think something that's crucially important, and we've got a lot of time to discuss that with anybody. At the end of the day, though, we just want you to be comfortable with your decision and be fully informed, and that's why we're here for. So.
And we want you to utilize information from the science and ask the questions. Always ask the questions. Just because somebody says this doesn't mean that is. Always ask questions, but rely on those people that have the background and the knowledge in the markets and in the genetics and in the industry as to what to base your decisions on. Don't just go by what I call coffee shop talk, and listen to, be sure that you listen. Refer to, if they have questions, please reach out to us at any time, your local reforestation advisor, your local Arborgen reforestation advisor. If you don't know who that is, visit our website. We have a link on there where you can find your local reforestation advisor, and all of us have extensive education and knowledge in forestry, backgrounds in forestry, and we all have a specialty or an expertise in some facet of forestry related. So in closing up, and thank you so much, Jason, for your time today. Thank you so much. Closing up with that, planting fewer trees does not mean that you're going to produce less wood. Planting fewer trees does not mean you're going to produce less wood. If you plant the right genetics, you're going to, instead of producing less wood, you're going to produce more value by planting the right genetics on the property that you own. And you're going to create that value across multiple disciplines in timber, in forest products, wildlife, aesthetics. You're going to create a healthier ecosystem and a healthier market. So with that being said, thank you all again for tuning in to this episode Lucky 13 of the TreeLines Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Jeffries. If you have any questions, please reach out to any of my colleagues or myself. You can find our contact information on our website, arborgen.com. And with that being said, I hope you all have a wonderful week, and tune in again next time for the next episode of Arborgen's TreeLines Podcast. Thank you and have a great day.